Okay, this is A Jury of Her Peers by someone, Suzanne Glaspell. So, biographical background, Glaspell was born and raised in Davenport, Iowa, and later moved to Greenwich Village, where she became the first modern woman playwright. She became a journalist at 18 and later worked her way through college as a news reporter, publishing many works before becoming one of the leading novelists of the time. Glaspell and her friend Eugene O'Neally launched a new type of drama that addressed topics such as suffrage, birth control, female sexuality, marriage, equality, socialism, and pacifism. And in 1931, she won the Pulitzer Prize for drama. Biographical lens. Many of Glaspell's works are set in a small Midwestern town like the one she grew up in, including A Jury of Her Peers, which is set in the country just outside of town. Through journalism, she wrote about the society she lived in and was constantly exposed to the movements happening. The thoughts that men have about women are very present in A Jury of Her Peers that reflect the time period. She didn't mask her thoughts in her works and positioned herself outside of society, often satirizing lifestyle. Glaspell does not shy away from describing the men in the story as rude to women and how they think that women should serve men and do domestic work, while they also make fun of how they spend their time. This is seen in a quote from the story. Women are used to worrying over trifles. And then questions. So what does the author's description of men in A Jury of Her Peers show about how the author views men? And then how does the author describe the social life from a woman's point of view versus the men's point of view?
I think that in the reading the short story with like her description of men throughout the whole story kind of shows that she's like really looking forward to like women's equality. Like she really tries to like look down upon the men for looking down upon the women type deal.
Yeah, because in the story, there's many lines where the men try to make jabs to the women, but in their minds, they're kind of like, well, you're kind of stupid for thinking that. Like, we found all this evidence, you didn't.
And the how does the author describe the social life from a woman's point of view versus the men's is it shows like the women don't really care as much about like they see it from her side, not just his side like of being murdered. Like they see that what drove her to be like murdering him.
Cool.
Yeah, they're really trying to make more excuses, like trying to defend the woman being prosecuted because the men aren't. Like, they don't really care as much. This is the historical lens. The main the story was written off of the 1901 trial of Margaret Hosack, and she was from Warren County, Iowa. She was convicted of killing her husband with an axe. The neighbors testified that her husband had abused her, but the prosecutor's main evidence was the motive of the murder. Hosack was found guilty by an all-male jury. In the short story, the women are the ones that find the majority evidence. Just like in the story, it is reasonable to assume that the author felt that the trial did not touch on the complexity of the real story. This was one of her first popular stories, her previous writing being academic journals. After the court reached a verdict, Glaspell felt the need to get the other side of the story out in the world, leading to her popularity in literature. The men in A Jury of Her Peers came to represent the lawyers in the court concerning the Hosack case. Oh, I guess they're not very dangerous things the ladies have picked out. The men decided that the evidence was unimportant. The women in the story could not be smarter than them. Both sides portrayed Margaret Hosack in ways that heavily relied on stereotypical views on women and marriage. That was fine in an academic journal shown at the very end. Two of the questions was, how does the women directly relate to the trial, specifically after finding the bird in the box, and how does knowing the historical background of the story affect your perspective of it now rereading it?
Well, they're the one who found all of the evidence that could have put Minnie away, kind of similar to the neighbors knowing that Margaret was being abused. And then, like, the how does the knowing the historical background of the story affect your perspective? It kind of like you relate more to the like women because you like understand their struggles as why they like murdered their husband. Like it's not just like a oh they murdered them, they should go to jail. It's like a they had a good like that was their only way out type of deal. The psychological lens and analysis. Opinions of female characters are often undermined. The behavior and motivations of the female versus male characters are significantly different. As the women uncovered clues in the kitchen, the men were too focused on the fact Miss Wright kept the house so unkempt. Follow the law versus pursuing justice. The motives of Mrs. Wright. Mrs. Wright was a victim of domestic violence, and in a fit of rage, her husband pushed her to her limit. Years after her marriage, Wright became isolated from her social life and oppressed due to her marriage and overwhelming farm work. Both Miss Peters and Miss Hale empathized with Miss Wright because of her hierarchical implications. The gender feminist lens. Undermining the women's ideas and opinions. Throughout the whole story, the men who are searching through the Wright household undermine the opinions of the two women that are with them. They end up finding the only critical evidence, and due to their beliefs, they hide it away to help their peer out of sympathy. Sexism of the time also played a role in this. The short story came out in the early 1900s, therefore, women were not thought of as equals at the time. When the women would ever come up with the reasoning behind something within the Wright household, the men would automatically blame Minnie for her lack of care for the household. For example, when George Henderson washes his hands in the kitchen sink, he's disgusted by the fact that the only thing he dries his hands with is a dirty towel, even like though Minnie wasn't there and couldn't have cleaned up before they went there anyways. And the ladies said that a farmer's wife's chores are never done, and they blamed Minnie for being lazy and not making a proper home for her husband. The women's inner thoughts also played a role in like Minnie's jail time. Throughout the whole story, the two women who are helping search through Minnie's house, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale, have found sympathy because of the men critiquing her housewife duties. They then find the box with a dead bird inside, which they assume is the motive. They then realize that Mr. Wright had killed the only outside interaction Minnie had, which was her pet bird, and that is what sent her over the edge and killed him. They then hide the bird so they have no evidence to convict Minnie on, since they realize the abuse that Mr. Wright placed on her. And my questions were, how does the blatant sexism of the men affect how the women approach Minnie's arrest? And do you think the men later realized the abuse, or did it stay between the women?
As far as the first question about the blatant sexism of the men, um, I think that towards the end, it did start to affect the women. Like they started to notice it, they started to get a little aggravated. And I think that was almost, I wouldn't say it's a motive, but it did have to go and play about like why they hit that bird. Sure, they wanted to help their fellow friend, but I think it kind of also was they, like the men didn't see them. They didn't believe that they could be of any use. So they kind of were like, ha, I'm gonna show you type thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's like they're getting revenge on the men, kind of in
Yeah.
their own way to help their friend because like they don't feel equal to them. Like they don't.
Yeah, like the men aren't gonna do anything. So they had to put matters into their own hand and they had to help their fellow
Woman.
woman.
Even though the men weren't finding any evidence at all and just being very critical of Minnie.
Well, the men weren't really trying.
Nope.
I mean, yeah. I don't think the men realized the abuse. I mean, they didn't find the bird.
And they probably took the guy that died his side
Oh,
anyway.
definitely, because bros stick together.
Bros before hoes.
But I don't know. I just feel like they probably didn't notice because they clearly they didn't notice the bird. If they're not going to notice the bird,
Yeah.
they're not going to really think into it, you know.
Yeah.
Also, but were they looking for a bird? Like, were they really looking for
No,
it?
they
They
weren't.
were
just
looking
looking
for.
reasons to like be like, no wonder he wasn't nice to like didn't let her outside.
Yeah,
I don't know.
like, also, I don't think that they were looking for anything to help her. They were looking for a motive why she killed him. Like, they did not care about helping her. They wanted to just get it over with, pretty much.
Mhm.
I kind of felt bad for Miss Peters because she's like the sheriff's wife, so she's
Oh
like
yeah. So she has.
actively going against her husband's job to be like,
Yeah, and like, when they came
She's
down,
really rude. So
yeah, I don't know. She was just like, I'm just simply gonna ignore the fact
yeah,
that
she
because
paused,
she
so
was straight.
the other woman had to quickly grab that bird.
mhm.
I know. She bawled out. She said, "In the pocket."
Go.
Okay, so I'll start out by talking about the symbolism in the text. And I said that the setting and atmosphere of it being winter and the outside air being brisk and nappy represents what could be seen as Mrs. Wright's life for all these years. I added that her being oppressed and locked up all along shows it has not been easy. Having the coldness of the season be brought into the story helps the reader see what it has been like for her as far as her marriage and her home. And then secondly, in the story, there was a jar of preserves
Give me a second.
about the story. And then the next slide, my lens was
Oh no, give me. My phone shut off in the middle of it.
by snapping its neck. He died soon after. The bird was caged, and this stood for Mrs. Wright and her actions she took upon her husband. So those were just some symbols that.
Nope, not at that point either.
And then secondly, in the story, there was a jar of preserves that symbolized the way Mrs. Wright felt. The jar would explode when it was cold and compressed, just as Mrs. Wright did after all those years of oppression and silence. The caged bird, which was talked about in the story, symbolizes the characterization of Mrs. Wright, and when her husband killed the bird by snapping its neck, he died soon after. The bird was caged, and this stood for Mrs. Wright and her actions she took upon her husband. So those were just some symbols that you could see throughout the story. And then the next slide, my lens was post-colonial. And the major question that was trying to be answered through this was, how does this text comment on, represent, or repress the marginalized voices? And I just want to first start off by saying that I thought this story represented society in a very unique way. The first point being female oppression. I said that throughout the entirety of the reading, Mrs. Wright is depicted as being diminished and oppressed with silence. Ultimately, this leads her to come out of the oppression with a murder. Collectively, the author shares this viewpoint as showing what female oppression looks like as a whole, all while providing specific examples of how Mrs. Wright is being held within for years. The second point I said was men versus women, and I said that this short story provides insight to what men thought about women. In the story, both the detectives and the husbands hint that the women aren't smart enough to find evidence, and that they're overall not as intellectually capable as the men who are on the case. And I added that culturally, the images created by the men in this short story diminish the intelligence and overall well-being of women. And then lastly, I said that conflicts in a jury of her peers may include how men see women. This is shown throughout the story because the way that the women are talked about and treated versus how they want to be or wish to be treated vary. In today's society, this still occurs on different levels and is still a prevalent issue. And then I added 2 questions to this, and they're both open-minded, so I didn't provide answers. But the first one is, how does the perception of women by men in this story help shape the major conflict throughout it? And then the second is, in what ways does the author demonstrate how Mrs. Wright was oppressed and what kinds of things are symbols for it in her private life?
Righty. Um,
The major conflict is kind of shaped by like the men like nag on Minnie the whole time throughout the whole like story. They're like, oh, maybe if she did this, he would let her outside more than once. And they were like, she was definitely still abused. Definitely still had no social interaction. That might be the issue. And then okay, hold on. She shows that she like Mrs. Wright is oppressed because she wasn't allowed to like in the very beginning. Mrs. Hale's like, hey, I remember Minnie back in the day before she was married. Like,
yeah, she was like all happy. No,
they're like,
she's
we were
not.
buddies. I haven't seen her since back in the day. Like, she like didn't get to talk to her friends. The only interaction she ever had was with this bird that is now got its neck snapped.
Oh, that bird.
Rip the bird.
And like they talk about her quilt a lot.
I
Like
didn't
how they're gonna
understand
finish the
quilt a
quilt.
lot.
I think the quilt is like I remember like they said something about it being like a certain type of knot and they like try to use the knot as it's like, oh, she killed her husband. So it's like this type of knot kind of thing. I cannot remember what the knot is called though.
Some quilting thing.
I'm not a quilter. So
Yeah, it like symbolizes how she killed her husband.
Well, like they were wondering if like one of the women should finish the quilt or
Oh,
if they should
yeah.
just knot it off and be done with it. And I think
I
that's
thought they
the
were
part
trying to
that like
give it like
symbolizes.
give it her something to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So sad. Imagine quilting in jail. I wonder what that's like.
I don't know. That seems kind of interesting. Like I feel like all the other criminals will be like, "Oh, she's quilting."
She's
What's
that
going
kind of
on?
person.
Is that the last one?
Yeah. And then we have our bibliography. Bibliography.
So pretty. All right, I guess we're done.
Yay.
Oh no.